Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Grace Lutheran Podcast. This is Pastor Matt Nupel. Thank you for tuning into our program today as we discuss different issues and topics about our lives in Jesus Christ. And as always, if you're living in the Winston-Salem or Paughtown area and you've been looking for a church that offers traditional Christ-centered worship, you are always invited to join us every Sunday morning at 10 a.m. at 3410 Community Church Road in Paughtown. Well, first, I just wanted to remind everyone of our Christmas Eve service of lessons and carols at 8 o'clock p.m. on Christmas Eve. We hope you're able to join us, and this is an extended invitation to all of our friends and family of Grace. So if you're able to join us again, that's 8 o'clock p.m. at Grace Lutheran Church on December 24th. Well, as many people at Grace know, I'm not always the most up-to-date when it comes to social trends or what's popular right now. And so a lot of people at Grace have asked me to check out this TV show called The Chosen, which is about the life and ministry of Jesus. And so I've kept saying that I'm going to watch it eventually, and I've not really had time until recently to finally sit down and watch Season 1. I would eventually like to watch Season 2 and offer a response to that as well, but for the time being and for this episode, I just wanted to offer a few initial thoughts not only for Season 1, but for the series as a whole. Just what I think about what the show is doing, how they're portraying the life and ministry of Christ. And so hopefully you can benefit from this. But before we get into the content of the show, I think this warrants an even bigger discussion about how the story of Jesus and how the gospel is often portrayed in the media. To start this discussion, I wanted to bring up an example from a recent Sunday school class that we had at Grace. Those of us who are at Grace know that we had a Sunday school class about Christian art throughout church history, and it was taught by Ashley Hurst. He did a wonderful job guiding us through different examples of Christian art throughout the early church, the Middle Ages. If you've ever been to an art show or a gallery where they have examples of Christian art throughout the Middle Ages, one thing you've probably noticed is that a lot of the settings and a lot of the characters that are portrayed in this art don't look like Palestinian Jews, but they're portrayed to look like Western Europeans. It's common to see examples of soldiers wearing things like chainmail armor and covered helmets. You'll often see peasant women wearing braided long hair instead of a hair covering. It would be like someone painting a picture of Mary Magdalene with a hoodie and leggings. Obviously, those things don't fit the historical original context. Now, whether or not this is an example of white supremacy, as some people will say, this is besides the point I'm trying to make for this episode. Maybe that's something that we can talk about in a later episode, if the Western European flavor of Christianity is an example of white supremacy or not. That's a pretty big mouthful for a very big topic. But for the purpose of this episode, I just want to talk about how these artists throughout the Middle Ages, they weren't trying to create something that was 100% historically accurate. These artists weren't creating their art to try to tell people, this is what Jesus and his disciples and all these places in Israel really looked like historically. Instead, like any good Christian artist, what they were doing was taking these recognizable stories from the Bible and applying them to their given context in a way that either preached a new message or emphasized an old message for people to hear and to see. In other words, these artists recognize that the stories within the gospel are timeless stories. They're stories that we can apply to our own lives in a way that's similar to the myths of our culture. That's something that we talked about in an earlier episode called Myth and Christianity. So it didn't matter if soldiers in Jerusalem actually wore chainmail or covered helmets or not. What matters is that God has met humanity in the person of Jesus Christ. And that message extends far beyond the original Jewish context of the gospel message. I wanted to share all of that with you because I think today we have this tendency to want to see complete historical accuracy in everything. When we see a portrayal of Jesus, or when we see the story of Jesus on a TV show or in the movies, we want it to be historically accurate. We want people to look the way they would have looked. We want settings to look the way that they would have been set. But I wanted to make the point that for the majority of Christian artists throughout history, that concept didn't even cross their mind. I have a few friends who are Calvinists who believe that it is a sin to recreate images of God in any way. So they would say that any example of Christian art where you're depicting God the Father, Son, or Holy Spirit is a violation of the commandment, you shall not make a graven image. And so when I talk to some of these guys and I ask them, why they believe this, one of the reasons that they inevitably bring up is we don't know what Jesus looked like, therefore we shouldn't try to recreate his image. And I think this attitude completely misses the point of what Christian art is supposed to be. Now, of course, there has to be a line drawn somewhere. And if you're someone who's setting about telling the story of the life of Jesus and his ministry, then it is going to be a little weird if you have it set somewhere like the Himalayas or on the moon or something. Of course, when we're telling the life of Christ, historical accuracy is going to play an important role. There's actually one very nitpicky example in The Chosen that we're going to talk about later where I think getting history wrong does have bigger consequences. But all of that to say, and I think if I'm being honest, I've seen clergy guilty of this more than anybody else, but we have this tendency to go into Jesus-centered movies or Jesus-centered TV shows with this preconceived idea that every single historical detail has to be 100% accurate. And I just don't think that's a fair expectation to put on any kind of media that's trying to tell the story of Jesus Christ. I also think a factor to consider is what does the artist have in mind with the aim for their art? And I think there's different purposes that different portrayals of the life and ministry of Jesus can have. When people ask me what is the best biblically accurate portrayal of Jesus that's accessible today, I still recommend the David Batty directed films of all of the Gospels. These are word-for-word adaptations of each of the Gospel stories. There's a narrator that reads the entire Gospel, and so if you want to watch the Gospel visually, I think this is still the best way to do it. Each of these films are incredibly long, but I think if you want to watch a biblically accurate portrayal of the Gospels, this is still your best bet. However, when it comes to something that's entertaining, something that's aimed at a family audience, something that can even spark a discussion among family and friends, then The Chosen is my new go-to recommendation for something like this. I am very impressed with The Chosen, with how entertaining it is, how engaging it is. I really can't speak highly enough about this show after just coming out of the first season. Not only is this the largest crowd-funded project, I think, in history, unless there's something that I'm missing, the fact that it's available for free to a wide audience still just, in a way, completely blows my mind. I mean, the production value is that of something that you would see on cable television. There's even a A-list actor on there. I forget his name, but he plays Nicodemus. He's been in a lot of different roles in Hollywood. One of the complaints that you hear from people who are critical of faith-based entertainment, not just entertainment around the Jesus story, is that the production quality is usually very low and the acting quality is usually very poor. And in a majority of cases, I have to say that I usually agree with this criticism. People are surprised to hear this from a Lutheran pastor, but I'll just confess this out loud on the podcast once and for all. I don't like the movie Fireproof. I'm sorry. I can see how people are able to relate to it and get something out of it. I can see the appeal, absolutely. But for me personally, just the bad acting and the poor quality of production is just too distracting for me. But then you have something like this, like The Chosen, which has its rare moments, I'll admit, but overall, considering this is a crowd-funded project, I mean, the production's very good. Another criticism you hear towards Jesus movies or TV shows is that oftentimes directors and writers have to take artistic liberty and add things or take things away to make the story flow better as a film. And what this does is it gives the audience a poor or at least warped impression of what the Bible really says. And again, I also agree with this criticism, and it's also why I'm critical of films like Son of God, back in 2014, which, if I'm being blunt, portrays Jesus like he's a confused hippie. The thing is, any kind of filmmaker or visual storyteller is going to have to take liberty with the story they're given. It doesn't matter what it is, and it doesn't matter if it's the gospel story or not. The scriptures weren't written to be visual, and so a visual artist is going to have to adjust this written document to make it a visual story for people to watch and be entertained. And that's not an easy task for anybody. But what I appreciate about The Chosen is that how they are very transparent about their need to do this. But they put this disclaimer at the beginning of their show. The Chosen is based on the true stories of the Gospels of Jesus Christ. Some locations and timelines have been combined or condensed. Backstory and some characters or dialogue have been added. However, all biblical and historical context and any artistic imagination are designed to support the truth and intention of the Scriptures. Viewers are encouraged to read the Gospels. I think this is a very simple yet effective solution to this dilemma. Instead of trying to create art that is woodenly accurate to the text and to history, they're taking creative and artistic license, but they're also pointing people back to the Gospels themselves and being honest by saying this isn't exactly what you find in the Bible, but we encourage you to read the Bible first and foremost to get the real scoop. Another thing I've really appreciated about this show is how they've been able to add these really detailed backstories to a lot of these characters in the Bible that we don't know a whole lot about, like Matthew or Peter and Andrew. But the creatives behind The Chosen were able to weave all of these backstories together in a way that creates an entertaining story that makes the viewer want to keep watching and see what happens. Going into The Chosen, I wasn't sure how I was going to appreciate or enjoy these added artistic elements of the gospel story, but I ended up really liking what they did with some of these creative decisions. For example, there's one episode where it's just this little girl that happens to find Jesus in his camp outside of Capernaum one day, and so she slowly starts bringing all of her friends to learn more about this mysterious carpenter out in the woods, and that's the whole episode. But that simple creative idea was able to keep you engaged for an entire episode, and it was really helpful in allowing us to see what kind of portrayal of Jesus this was going to be. I think it would be worth just making a few comments about the portrayal of Jesus Christ on this show. And I think it goes without saying for a lot of us that the star, Jonathan Roumie, has done a fantastic job portraying Jesus. Now, I'm not an actor by any means, but I would imagine that for any actor that's trying to tackle the role of Jesus Christ, one of the biggest challenges would have to be being so well-rounded as a character. I mean, you have to be really funny when you're trying to be funny, and you have to be really convincingly serious when you're trying to be serious. And I think that's something that Jonathan Roumie's been able to do really well so far, so I just wanted to commend the acting choice for this role. Now I want to take just a minute to talk about my favorite scene in the show so far. And this is when I started to really appreciate what the show was trying to do. This is back in episode 2 called Shabbat. It may have been a while since some of you have seen season 1, so let me just set the stage for you. So Mary Magdalene has just been healed by Jesus Christ from being possessed. And so after being healed, Mary wants to return to her old Jewish way of life, and so she wants to host a Sabbath meal. So it's her first time celebrating the Sabbath in a really long time, and so there's a couple setups for jokes along the way about, trying to remember all the pieces and components of a Sabbath meal. So Mary gets everything ready for the Sabbath meal. She invites her friends over, and one of her friends points out and asks Mary, "Who's this extra chair for?" And so Mary responds by saying, "Well, this is the chair of Elijah. This is the chair that we put out to await the return of Elijah as a sign that we are always ready for his coming." But then one of Mary's friends gently corrects her and says, "Oh, no, Mary, that's what we do for a Seder meal. We don't do that for a Sabbath meal." And so they all kind of have a quick laugh about it together, and the scene continues. But then, before they begin the meal, there's a knock at the door, and so Mary goes to answer it, and it's Jesus. And so Jesus asks if he can join them for their Sabbath celebration. So Mary invites him in, and the only place that there's room for him to sit at the table is at the seat of Elijah, that Mary prepared thinking that was a Sabbath tradition. I thought this was an incredibly creative and powerful scene that effectively showed the audience who Jesus is, that in him, what the people of God have been waiting for has been fulfilled. And not only that, but it's oftentimes fulfilled in a way that we don't expect, much like Mary Magdalene, who put this chair out by accident. but Christ still comes in to fulfill what Mary's been waiting for regardless. Now, someone who's really fixed on the historical accuracy stuff would have a field day with this scene. Well, technically, there wasn't a seat of Elijah during Seder meals at this time in Jewish history. Or, well, technically, they wouldn't have sat at a literal table to have the Sabbath meal. Or, well, technically, Mary Magdalene wouldn't have actually been reading during the Sabbath meal. But how many of us know that stuff well enough for it to affect the story that's trying to be told in front of us? And for most of us that aren't educated and haven't gone to seminary and haven't studied these things on their own, it really doesn't matter. What matters is the story that they're trying to tell, and is it being reverent to the source material? So as I said, I'm not as critical of the historical accuracy stuff, unless it's deliberately teaching the audience something that's not true. And I don't know if this really qualifies yet, because The Chosen's been very clear that they're taking license with things creatively. But as I said before, there's one tiny nitpick with The Chosen that I want to spend a little bit of time talking about. Now, in case I haven't made myself clear, I do highly recommend The Chosen. I think it's a great show. It's a much better alternative to other options out there, both secular and other Jesus stories, I think. So, of course, the show follows each of the apostles, and in season 1, it seems like they spend a lot of time focusing on Matthew. And so there's a few scenes where we see Matthew writing things down in a rough-looking little notepad. And so in these scenes, we get the impression as the audience that this is kind of a wink-wink, that he's writing down his eventual gospel, the Gospel of Matthew. Now, to be fair, I think I can see what they're at least trying to do with these scenes. I can sense a little bit of a comedic undertone with some of this, so I try not to take it, too in-depth. But at the same time, I see a lot of people watching those scenes and taking from that and thinking, oh, that must be how it really happened. That must be how Matthew actually wrote his gospel, and that's really not how it happened at all. We are fairly certain that Matthew wrote his account of what happened much, much later, after Jesus ascended into heaven. And in a way, I think if we're teaching that the Gospels were written as Jesus was walking and teaching people, then that kind of sells the Gospels themselves short. Because we know the Gospels were written in the wake of a post-resurrection or a post-Easter faith, a faith that recognized who Jesus Christ was from the very beginning of the Gospel to the very end. So while the Gospels do utilize eyewitness accounts and testimonies, it's very unlikely that the Gospels were written as Jesus was walking and teaching. And I think portraying it that way does give a wide Christian audience a false impression of what biblical authorship really looks like. But so far, that's really my only major criticism of the show. If you're looking for family-based Christian entertainment, I think this is a great option. For members of Grace, I would encourage you to read the Bible passage that each episode is based on if you're going to watch it together as a family. I think this is the best way to generate discussion on what God's Word says versus what a lot of the really clever creatives over at The Chosen say. But it looks like that's all the time we're going to have for this topic today. As I said before, in the future, I will do a review on Season 2. But in the meantime, I hope you have a great rest of your Advent and Christmas. Take care, and God bless.